Howdy, I'm Northern Dice and I'm going to be previewing The Art of War, the card game. Produced and designed by C&B Games, it's a 2 to 4 player card battle game which takes about 30 minutes to play. The Art of War is a tactical card game for 2 to 4 players that takes about half an hour to play. The aim of the game is to win 2 rounds, and the way that is done is by having the most health points on your played units at the end of any round. Rounds end when all players have passed. The winner of the game is the first player to win 2 rounds, which usually happens on the 3rd round in a 2-player game, on the 4th round in a 3-player game, and the 5th round in a 4-player game. There are circumstances where players may need to play extra rounds, but that is covered in the rulebook inside of itself. We've never encountered that. Each faction in The Art of War is completely unique and is comprised of about 19 cards. Of these cards, you have 2 leader cards in ruby, 3 hero cards in gold, and 4 lesser hero cards in silver. And the rest of your deck is comprised of these iron cards, which are in almost like a grey border. And that's how they're identified. And when you comprise your deck, you are allowed to have a single leader, which is the first card you will choose, up to 2 gold cards and up to 3 silver cards. The rest of the deck is then comprised of the iron cards. Of course, you do not have to choose to have any gold or silver cards. You could just have entirely focused iron cards, for that example. And each faction has a very different approach, in the same way that inside of each faction, each leader has a very different approach. So in the example here, we have 2 very different abilities. One says apply or remove the silence token from any 2 units on the field. Each card with a silence token cannot be activated, and the other, destroy the unit with the highest or smallest number of health points on the field. If there are several units with this equal health points, then destroy them all. On the other hand, you may choose to go for the purples. And of course, their abilities again differ from one another. Draw a card from the common deck to your hands, or play this card as a spy and then draw a card from the faction reserve deck, and return any unit from your side of the field back to your hands. They play very differently, and there are different approaches to using them best. There is no perfect method, because each time that you create your deck, you may choose to use completely different cards. With having such a vast number of cards and tactics available, it means that there is a real amount of replayability that we found to this. It's the point where I have played this red faction several times over and never had a constant progression of tactics. It has always been very much, I've chosen my cards at the start to try and work towards something, but as things have gone on, I've had to change my tone and tactic, but it's still been applicable because of the cards that I've chosen. It's just how well it has worked against my opponent's tactics, and that's where these cards come in. Now this is the common deck, which is a deck that is shared by everybody. Everyone has access to this deck, and this is built completely random from the massive deck that you get in the game as the whole set. But in any number of player games, you would have 10 cards per player. So in a 2-player game, 20, in a 4-player game, 40. And at the start of the game, when everyone has created their deck, you then roll the dice to establish who would go first. Whoever gets the highest number would then draw 5 cards from this deck. And of course, there are repeats in this deck, meaning that there are cards that would be visible, that would appear twice and may appear in multiple people's fields. An example of the Freezing Soldier, where in this hand I got 2 of them. What these do is bulk out your deck to build it up to, from the original 10 that you would start with, you would then add 5 and you would end up with 15 in hand. And then you also have your reserve deck, which is the cards that you didn't add to your initial hand. And then there's also still the common deck available to everybody as well. As time goes on, each round you would draw new cards from your faction deck and from the reserve deck, from your faction reserve deck and from the common deck. But of course, every single round that the game goes on, less cards would be drawn. And there is a real knack to this game, because it's not a game where you can just expel all your cards as quickly as possible onto the field in order to get as many health points out as possible. You're limited in the number of cards you've got, and sometimes there is a real edge in knowing when to quit, when's best to just throw in the towel, and when is best to maybe really push hard for that victory. you don't ever regain cards, and if you only play one in the first round and somebody else wastes all their cards in the second, you'll still have all those original cards. They won't necessarily have as much power, which means that you've got a much easier time. It's about knowing when is best to attack and when is best to pass. What makes every card unique is that every single card will have a different ability based on what it is, but also a lot of these cards have different attributes. These attributes actually change how the card will work when it's played. Some cards, like this Cleric, have 0 attributes, so nothing special. It is a case if you play him, his ability will come into effect, and that is that. Some, like the Freezing Soldier, have an ability that triggers on death, and his on death ability is when this unit dies, activate the effect of any friendly unit with the Order attribute, regardless of which player's turn it is. Which brings us on to the Order attribute, which is this one, this little scroll. And if it has a little scroll associated to it, it means that it's an ability that could activate a second time, in the example of this Archer. So if the Freezing Soldier were to activate the On Death attribute, this Archer would then activate and do her ability again. And then we have the Spy unit, which is indicated by this. And the unique thing about this is that you don't play it to your side, you would play it to an enemy side. It would then sit on that side and be a bit of a problem for them because it still counts towards your actual total because it is one of your cards. Now, there aren't many spies in the game in the same way there aren't many on-death abilities, but there are lots of attributes that allow you to activate the ability a second time. So again, how you build your deck is going to be determined on what you want to really cash in on. So in the example of building a deck, I may choose to begin with this leader, which is the first card that is chosen by any faction. And with that, you would also share this with everybody who you are playing with. This is the only card that is shared information. You'd read the ability and explain what you can do. After that, you'd then build your deck. Now, you'd want it to complement your ability. And of course, for this one, we have chosen destroy the highest or smallest number of health points on the field. And when we say the field, we mean everybody's boards. When we talk about a side or your side, we're talking about your board. Because it's the field, it means that there is a risk that if you have the highest number of health points when you activate that, you would kill your unit. So you probably want to go for something quite balanced with this one. So let's go for this fella with 11. We'll go for a 10. We'll go for a 9. Of course, we'll go for a 1, and we'll also go for this card. And I've picked up several different types of cards here. All these cards have one thing in common, and that is the faction symbol to tell you which card they belong to, because there are instances where people can take your cards and add them to their field. Or in certain circumstances where you would play them to your field. Now here we have a tactic card, which doesn't go onto the field and is put straight into this area, which is the graveyard. And that would be an instant effect. We have a hero who would go onto the field and you'd activate his ability upon placement. Another hero, and of course the one that I didn't pick up is the mage. And when you use a mage, chances are it's going to manipulate the game as opposed to attack someone directly. Sometimes they will create item cards, sometimes they will attack health points directly bypassing shields. It is very much a case of specific unit-specific abilities. And of course, with this one, it says optional, which means that it is an optional thing. Now, all these are from the same deck. They're all from the same faction, and that would be our build, removing that mage, so we don't have too many. So we should now have 1, 2 gold, 3 silver, and our ruby, which means that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we now need another 4 cards, and these are going to be our iron cards. And we'd want them to complement the deck nicely, because this is going to be our starting hand, so we'll probably go for the highest health, if that's the drive we're going for. The rest would then become our faction reserve, so we shuffle these up. They would go there, and our leader card would be removed. We then have our hand of cards in our faction. We have our faction reserve. We now just need to draw 5 cards from the common deck in order to 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 cards from the faction reserve in order to bulk out our hand. And of course, with this, we have the Guillotine, which destroys the unit with the highest points on the field, which is an excellent complement to the ability that we chose for our leader. Distribute 10 health points, again, could become in really handy. Deal 2 points, and then if you kill the enemy, deal another 5, a fantastic one. And the Freezing Soldier, which has an on-death ability. On a player's turn, they will play a single card from their hand to their field and activate its ability. So for us, we may choose to play this Cleric, which says, add 2 defense points to the nearest unit on the right and left of this card. We could play that straight away, but it'd be a bit of a moot point because what happens is it activates and any units to its right and left would get health points. We don't have any health points to play. But when we do play a card, we have 2 rows to play to. We have, of course, row 1 and row 2. And we also have numerical values, which would be, of course, the first card, second card, third card, fourth card, fifth card, sixth card. And then there is, in the future, going to be spaces for item cards on these boards. But these would just sit on the side and affect the row which they are associated to. It depends on where you play the cards, dependent on what their ability will do in some circumstances. If we were to go through another round, we then need to make sure that we've got the actual health points associated to. And these come in increments of 1, 5 and 10, so we put a 5 on that card. If we were to play around and someone were to attack our Cleric and do 4 damage, we would remove the 5 and replace it with a 1. If the round were to end there, we would have 1 victory point towards victory because we have 1 card of 1 health point. On our next turn, we may choose to not want to play a unit, but instead play a tactics card, and we may play the Inn, which says distribute 10 health points to one of your units on the field. We play that to the graveyard, like so, and we would get 10 health points to distribute to our units, and because we only have 1, it'd be sensible to just give this Cleric the 10. We then may go through another round, and this time we may be in a position where nothing bad actually happens. So we may choose to play another hero, and we may choose to play Bogatyr. And he is played there, and it says, add 9 defense points to this card. At 10, sorry. So we would give him his 10 health as necessary, and then we'd give him 10 defense points. And defense points work like a cushion, so if we were to be attacked by 6, we would remove 6 from his defense points and reduce it to 4. If, in a different circumstance, we were attacked for 13, we'd remove the 10 and then take 3 damage, because it would then be 13, take away the 10 defense points, gives us 3 damage to his health. Defense points don't count towards the victory, but they are excellent at absorbing that damage. Now later on in the game, we may be in a position where we actually want to attack one of our units, which sounds mental, but slow me down. The Archer card says deal 2 damage points to any unit on the field, and if the target was destroyed as a result, then deal another 5 points of damage to any other unit on the field, which could be really handy against an enemy, because as much as we may lose up to 2, they would be losing 5. So we may use that Archer, stock her health as necessary, and then choose to attack our Freezing Soldier, which, if you remember, has an on-death ability of activate any effect of a friendly unit with the order attribute, regardless of which player's turn it is now. So we do that immediately as soon as he has died. So we could then activate the Archer again, which would then be, we'd deal the 5, then deal another 2, and then deal another 5 should we choose to attack the man without a face. But of course, the more cards we play, the less cards we'll have in hand in the subsequent rounds. And in a 4-player game, we will want to try and reserve as many cards as possible. We don't want to be spending all these cards in the first round to get a big meaty victory, only to be left with a single card in the end. I really enjoyed playing the Art of War, the card game. I think it is a really well-designed and executed card battle game for 2 to 4 players. My partner and I played this a lot at 2 players. We did have a quick dabble in the co-op, trying to 2-hand, and you do need extra players for it, but we could see that it'd work because you were almost having, instead of having your own field, an extended field, and that communication as well, I can imagine, would work well. But this preview is going to be centered on that head-to-head element, even though this can go up to 4 players. So we have played as all 4 factions, and we've played as all 4 factions a fair few times, and what we found was that no 2 games were ever the same. no matter how many times we played as a single coloured faction, we'd never produce the same results. And it's because you're able to build your deck to a point with the faction. So you have 19 cards, you reduce it to 10. Depending on which leader you choose, you'll choose different cards. And initially, it was a case of we just picked the highest health cards and ignored the abilities, and that was to our detriment. As time went on, it wasn't always necessarily that case. What's more is because the common deck impacts your decisions later on, it meant that what cards we got there also changed what we'd do. So, in example, if we were to use the Graphite deck, the Graphite faction, we would be wanting to get as many artillery units as possible because the entire ability of that leader, one of those leaders, is to activate all artillery units. So having as many of those on the field as possible was always a good thing. But because we could only have so many in hand from our actual faction, we were then dependent on that reserve. And it didn't, the common deck, and it didn't always produce. Which meant that we started to see these big abilities, instead of like a centre stage focus for your entire deck, it became more of, in some circumstances, more of a gambit. You wanted to make sure your deck was balanced enough to complement the abilities you'd chosen, but also so that it wasn't just centred on one focal point. And that was a learning curve, and it was a good one, because it meant that there was more that we could do in the game. And it also meant there was more replayability. Not only on that learning element, but knowing that just because your two leaders do certain things doesn't mean you have to centre everything on them. We've played games where we never use the leader. I mean, fantastic as they are, you know, because they are supposedly the leader of your army, they've only got 6 health. Compared to some of these units, they are pretty squishy, and they will be taken out very quickly and put straight into your graveyard. What else we liked was how diverse the abilities were in that common deck. It was very generic in some circumstances, so an example, retrieve a card from the graveyard, or play an item, or destroy an item, for example. But I think it was that generic ability pool that the decks for the factions need. As I've said, they are sort of centred on a certain thing, with the blue one, in example, being oriented around bulking up health and having units that will stay on the field as long as possible, and the Graphite one being artillery oriented. They don't have the scope to do other things very interestingly. And it's quite often that common deck that you're going to want to get those really diverse cards in, because then you'll be able to get the big plays like killing a freezing soldier to activate an ability a second time, or getting the archer so you can quickly take out one unit to then deal big damage to another. As much as your faction will get you the grounds and the basis for that big health pool and those victory points, it's the common deck I found and the abilities within it that actually balanced out that either overpoweredness or the later on not having enough faction cards. It meant that you could use those to chip away at health or do the interesting things to make sure that you still had enough cards in hand of good quality to survive the next couple of rounds, or use them to get those cards back that you know full well are going to be very handy. An example of getting the artillery units back, because I'll tell you what, those are few and far between when you play as that Graphite faction. So what's the actual component quality like? To say this is a prototype, we were really impressed. The actual artwork on these cards is, just from the backs, really, really, really gorgeous. Of course, the leader cards are at the minute unillustrated, and that is put into the rules that we received, saying that it is something they're going to address. But then you look at the actual cards across the board in terms of others. So I'll just grab a few and I'll grab a couple of commons. And there is a really lovely, almost fantasy role-playing artwork to them. So you have the freezing soldier, you've got the guillotine. They all look, when they are heroes, like heroes or people who would be high up in sort of a kingdom. Our only qualm with the actual artwork is that it is that fantasy element. It is a fantasy game. It is that medieval feel of you are knights and you are fighting and you have just discovered siege weapons. If that theme isn't something that's going to appeal to you, you might find it quite hard to get your head into this game. And that's a real disappointment, because this is a really lovely game despite its theme. I like the fantasy theme for that matter. I think it is really, really well done. It's executed excellently. It fits really well into that art of war encompassing genre, you know, as the name of the game is. But if you aren't into that and you do think when you see fantasy Dungeons and Dragons and sitting around a table rolling dice, well, give it a try because it's good. But the game is fantastic regardless of its theme because of how well executed it is. In terms of the components, once again, the prototype cards, they're of good quality, but if this is the standard that you would get in the main game, I'd be happy with that. I mean, they are single layer. It's not like it's going to be anything fancy for a prototype. I don't know how Indiegogo works with stretch goals, but my hope would be that they'd be a little bit more reinforced. And the player boards, I thought were lovely because it took me a couple of games to actually realise that these were oriented to factions. So just clear this one off. It took me ages to realise that this was the blue faction emblem, because when we first started we played as the graphite and the red, the ruby one. Is it ruby? I don't know. The graphite and the red one. And I think it's just a really lovely little touch. It's completely unnecessary. Completely unnecessary. But oh my goodness, was I really, really like, oh wow, that's really lovely. On top of that, they have got that acknowledgement as well that they know that boards aren't for everybody. You know, when you unfold them, sometimes they're a little bit bent. So they actually included as well these little tokens, which allow you to actually play the game without the board. So you could just put the tokens where they need to be, 3 cards aside. It also means that it's then good for on the go, because this game isn't one that necessarily needs to be played at a table. You could easily just have 40 common cards, the decks needed, off you pop, go out at the park or something, or wait in an airport, get the cards out, have a quick game. Because it does genuinely take about 30 minutes to play, and that is not one round, that is 30 minutes for the whole game. Really, really, really speedy. Once you've got your head around it and those decisions are made in your head, it's fine. There is always that risk of analysis paralysis, but I'll talk about that in a bit. The other bit with the components is these, which are the health and shield tokens. And these are double-sided, so if you've got 10 shield, you flip it, it's 10 health. I think they do what they need to do, and I think it's quite handy that they are in those increments of 1, 5 and 10. It's just about having them on the right side at the right time. I don't know, maybe in my head I'd almost want like 2 circles on the card to say where they go, but then I know that it'd ruin the artwork. There's lots of ways to address it, but maybe it's just me nitpicking, maybe it's an issue that doesn't need addressing. When you're actually playing the game, it does feel really, really intense, and not like overly intense, but intense enough to be 100% focused on the game. You want to win, but you need to also be aware of what everyone else is playing, what their health pools are, what sort of abilities they've got going on, whether it's an ability that can be replayed or whether it's an on-death ability. And that takes a couple of rounds, couple of games to get your head around, but once you have, again, it does feed into that speediness of the game. And now I quickly mentioned analysis paralysis a second ago. It is a thing in this game when you first start. Because some of these abilities are so specific, in the example of the cleric saying that on the left and right cards will get shields, you'd need to at first have had cards placed on the field to the left and right to play them effectively. But then you might also start over-considering, if you play the cleric early, is it worth it to get the shield? Or if you play cards early, are they going to get destroyed and then your turn's for naught? It's one of those, it's the nature of the beast with this sort of game. No matter what happens, you're always going to have an opportunity to analyse the board and make sure you know exactly what you're doing, when you're doing and how you're going to do it. But the one thing you can't ever consider is what everyone else is going to do, or the cards they've got in hand other than their leader. And because of that, it becomes this over-encompassing beast of, oh my goodness, if I do it wrong, it's all going to fall apart. And that happens in the first couple of games. After that, it doesn't, because I feel like there's that point in learning this game where suddenly you recognise that it is just a case of not only knowing when to play a card, but knowing when to retreat. So, as we said earlier in the actual little explanation, you only get so many cards throughout the game, you only get so many cards in hand at any one point, and when cards are played, they're gone, and you don't get many back. So if you play all 19 cards in the first round, you've got no cards left for the rest of the game. On that other hand, If you are in a position to play a single card pass, you'll have lots of cards for the next round. But does that then mean that you're giving the round away to someone else? I think it's part of being a good leader to your little army, as it were, and it almost makes it quite thematic knowing that the battle is lost, but you haven't lost the war yet. Or in that example of, we need to win this battle to get a good foothold, put everyone else on edge. Because if it is that circumstance where you've got one win and it looks like you're going to win again, people aren't going to pass. They are going to go absolutely ham against you. And maybe it's at that point that you recognise you need to pass, because that way then you'll at least have some cards in your reserve ready to play to get that final victory. It does make you think. And of course, as I said, nature of the beast is analysis paralysis, that overthinking, that taking too long to make a decision. But as time goes on and you get used to the cards and what they can do, it does feel like you could just pick up even a faction that's new to you, get your head around the cards, build that deck and just go with it. And I think it's, again, those common cards that almost give you that crutch to do so, because even if you're not 100% on the faction cards, you know the common cards are very much going to help you to do stuff. Learning those tactics comes with time. And again, it's not exactly a tactic that'll work every time, because the cards are so diverse and the deck you build will be so diverse that there is no chance you'll play the same game twice. And I think that's fantastic. In a nutshell, I think this game's fantastic. I know it was originally based on the game Gwent from The Witcher, which unfortunately I've never played and I have no experience with Gwent, so this was completely a new concept to me. And maybe that's done me favours because I've been able to go into this objective and look at it and actually have a clear view of what's going to happen without those rose-tinted goggles of thinking, why is it not more like, or why is it less like Gwent? I think this game, just as it is lovely. I think it works excellently. I think the actual playing of cards, one at a time on a round, makes sense, because as much as it may feel slow, if you were to play 2 cards straight away, you're then going to be asking for 2 cards to get destroyed. Playing cards slowly to build up that health pool is more important, and you're never going to be in a position where at the start of the game you don't have anything to play. It's then how you play them throughout the game that's going to determine how well you'll do in the later games. I really would genuinely recommend this. If you are a fan of those head-to-head battle games, the card games, games with a lovely fantasy theme, or something a little bit different in terms of an actual card deck builder, because you initially build that deck, you don't gradually build it, you build it straight away. If you're a fan of that sort of game, or a game with that unique edge, I'd really recommend this. Really, really, really recommend this. I wouldn't recommend this game for you if you are someone who is not one for those head-to-head tactical games. If you want something that is all action all the time, unfortunately this has a lot of tactics to it. There's a lot of thinking required. You're going to have to do a lot of forward planning. You are going to need to know what the cards do. It's not going to be a case of you'll draw a card, realise it's got a massive attack, play it and win. And it's not a case of you've got so many cards in hand, you know that if you play them all at once you'll win. It needs to be done slowly and gradually, and you do actually almost need to lead that army sensibly to be able to get a better edge. I really, really, really enjoyed this game. It really surprised me with how great it was, and I would really recommend it. It is on Indiegogo now. I would check it out.